Hello. One of your assignments for this class is to read the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation, and today I want to talk about the history of these documents. The Constitution does not exist on its own. It was written by men in a particular time and place, and as a response to the difficulties posed by the Articles of Confederation. So today our focus is very local. Instead of global processes, I want to explore how local contingencies shaped history and continue to shape our world today. Individual people making choices and decisions were the causes of our current situation, and understanding the historical context for their actions helps us understand how the government works today. Understanding the concerns and compromises made during the writing and ratification of the Constitution helps us grasp what the document means and how it works. What are the effects of its rules? Some of those effects have to do with the coming of the Civil War, so it's worth knowing how the documents operate and where they came from, their goals as well as their dictates. The Constitution is, of course, one of the founding documents of the United States and still guides our government today. It defines the three branches of American government and the relationships among those branches, what each is supposed to do, and how it should balance the others. The Constitution also guides the relationship between the federal government and the individual states, and also individual people. With its 3/5 clause, though, and its provisions for representation and taxation, it asks the question, who are the people? Who counts as a citizen? This is one of the guiding questions of American history, and it introduces the second major theme of this course. I've spoken about the first major theme several times, the complicated relationship between ideals and economics, and we're going to see this theme reflected in the Constitution. But we're also going to begin considering who counts in American history and why. Who is a legal person? And how does that definition affect the functioning of government and the use of the Constitution? That is one of the principal questions of American history, and it appears from the very start, from the founding documents of American government, including the Constitution. Understanding the historical context of the Constitution helps us understand the history of politics in the United States, the political parties, which try to represent various streams in American political thought. Those who think that national government exists to defend the general welfare, as the Articles of Confederation demonstrated that individual states could not do, and those who want government to be small, cheap, and close to home. This divide exists in politics today, but it finds its origins in the arguments surrounding the Constitution, which itself represents a series of compromises between these two competing arguments. So, let's turn to the history of the Constitution and its predecessor, the Articles of Confederation, to understand a little bit about the history of politics in the United States up to 1877. The Articles of Confederation were a first try at doing what the Constitution does now. The Articles of Confederation came before the Constitution and set up a government that functioned for 6 years during the War for Independence. The Articles were operational for 6 years and guided the government during the American Revolution that resulted in independence from Britain. It was the experience of trying to govern under the Articles of Confederation that made the Founding Fathers try again. The problems revealed by the Articles of Confederation were the problems the Constitution was designed to solve. So, understanding the operation of the Articles helps us understand the response and correction applied in the Constitution. So, let's turn to the exciting days of 13 colonies seeking independence from Great Britain and setting up a government of their own. The first move was to gather together all the colonies into one body to speak to Great Britain. It was from these efforts to present a united front that the colonists began to see themselves as one thing, as Americans, rather than South Carolinians or New Englanders subject to Great Britain. When they gathered representatives of all the colonies into one room, they called it the Continental Congress, or the Philadelphia Congress, because it met in Philadelphia. It met for 6 weeks in the fall of 1774 to try to hash out the mechanisms of how the independent states would set up a government. They were trying to figure out how to respond to the intolerable acts from Britain, and also how to write a response that represented all the colonies. Pulling those people together was the main goal. That was 1774, and 12 of the 13 colonies sent representatives, who wrote a document called the Articles of Association, which itself established another meeting and ways to proceed. That was the Second Continental Congress, which convened in May of 1775 and had a bigger role. This Congress appointed the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, which then gave the job of drafting a document to young Thomas Jefferson, then 33 years old. The man who pushed for this task to be assigned to Jefferson was John Adams, who was a Massachusetts lawyer who had ambitions for a continental government. This is interesting, because later John Adams and Thomas Jefferson would end up fighting one another, fierce and dirty, for the presidency. Jefferson and John Adams ended up at opposite ends of the political spectrum, but at the start of the contest for independence, they were great friends and allies. The Continental Congress appointed the committee that wrote the Declaration, and another committee to write the document to explain the way the 13 colonies, 13 sovereign nations fighting Great Britain, would operate. They wrote the Articles of Confederation, which you have been assigned to read in this class. This document was sent to the states for ratification in 1777, and the Continental Congress also stayed in operation throughout the war. It printed money, it established a committee for foreign relations, and it strengthened the local militias. The Congress also appointed George Washington, who had distinguished himself in the 7 Years' War, as the commander of the Continental Army in 1776. These were, almost by accident, the actions of a national government, when the very first statement of the article is to declare that each state retains the sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the U.S. Congress. Nonetheless, I think it's important to realize that these men were thinking big from the start. You notice that I keep using the word continental, because they did. They called their army Continental and their Congress Continental, and we need to take seriously the fact that they were working hard to create a continental response to the empire and a continental form of government. The men who were planning the government wanted it to be as big as the whole continent, restless and expanding, a big, buoyant enterprise. The Second Continental Congress governed for 6 years, until March 1st, 1781. The whole of the war, and the document they lived by, their version of the Constitution, was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, as you'll read for yourself, was a rather gentle confederation, composed of individual sovereign nations. It described the states in a firm league of friendship with one another, and stated that any action of government that was not explicitly given to the central government remained the rights of the states. In other words, the Articles of Confederation assumed the rights of the states as a default setting. Above all, the national government had no right to tax. It left that in the hands of the states. When you read Article 8, you'll see that only individual states could levy taxes, which were then paid up to the national government. It was kind of a states' rights heaven by today's standards. But real sovereignty for the individual states meant that the Articles of Confederation demanded unanimous consent to change it. Remember, Article 8, which states that the Union shall be perpetual, nor shall any alteration at any time hereafter be made in any of them, unless such alteration be agreed to in a Congress of the United States, and be afterwards confirmed by the legislatures of every state. To ratify or amend the Articles required a national consensus. Think about how clogged up today's government has become, how difficult it is to pass anything, even for the party entirely in charge of every branch of government. All the worse when you needed complete agreement, all states ratifying every single decision. This provision meant that any state could stop national expansion just by voting against the admission of another state, perhaps one with a competing economy. Any state could stop any military action or use its jealousy of another state to stop a measure that would benefit its rival. And we're a nation that kind of thrives on rivalries in our sports teams and leagues, in our states and how we look down on one another or envy one another, in our racial and political history. So the United States under the Articles of Confederation were not a very united place. The result was that individual states waged commercial warfare on one another. They would declare tariffs on one another's goods in order to protect local industry, and this protectionism, relic of the mercantilist age, thereby stifled economic growth. For example, there's a big coal field that stretches under parts of western Pennsylvania and Virginia. And Virginia could say, we won't buy coal from Pennsylvania, or we'll slap a high tariff on it to protect our industry. And the result was that the industry could be inefficient, but protected from competition. A state could even stop another state from developing by voting against the measures its representatives brought to Congress. The result of states' rights was that everything cost more and was fragmented at both the economic and political level under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, too, that the nation was at war. It costs a lot of money to wage war. Remember that when you think about the deficit. And the nation couldn't even raise taxes to pay for war. Essentially, it printed money and borrowed money, and this ended the way it usually does, in inflation, which means that prices keep going up and money buys less and less. The commercial disorder resulted in foreign relations difficulties. Think about it. How can a brand new nation say to France, recognize us as a nation? When one state buys your goods and another one taxes them, how should we ask France to treat us as a single unit when each sets its own trade policy? As the war continued, the situation became dire, and the men who were continentally minded began to contemplate a change. With peace in 1783, the young nation's difficulties had just begun. When wars end, the result can be significant economic dislocation. Demobilization. Men are released from military service and must find jobs. The government is buying less. Uniforms, guns, horses and wagons, food. Demand shrinks for all the things a government needs to fight a war, but doesn't need to buy anymore. This leads to an economic slowdown or even depression. With the young United States so deep in debt, the Articles of Confederation bind them to pay those debts. And yet the national government had no means to raise taxes. And it had to rely on the individual states, which had their own debts to pay. Still, it's good for a young nation to pay its debts, as Haiti has had to do for 150 years after its independence. Alexander Hamilton was partly responsible for arranging the financing the nation needed for the war, and the Founding Fathers wanted to pay back those debts, and to set up a means for doing so. The answer to their problems was to call another convention, which met in 1787 to draft a new document for governing the United States. They knew that even though they had won their independence, that their freedom was only as strong as its defense, and they felt that a stronger national government would provide for a more meaningful peace. They also wanted a stronger national government to operate commercially in the world and to pay the nation's debts, and this was the purpose of the Constitution. When the Constitutional Convention met, it found that the trickiest problems to find agreement among the independent states were issues of representation, which meant issues of counting people. And who counts as people for purposes of representation and taxation? Because, as I've said before, freedom was itself a spectrum, rather than an either-or proposition. It wasn't simply that people who were not slaves were free people. It was more complicated than that. The Constitution mentions any number of types of people and whether or not they count. Free persons, those bound to service for a term of years, Indians not taxed, and then other persons, by which they meant slaves. The other categories counted where representation and taxation were concerned, but the other persons were counted as 3/5 of a person for these purposes. This does not mean they had representatives. It does not mean they could vote. It meant that they were counted in order to add to the number of representatives held by their owners who could vote. In other words, the 3/5 clause gave more power, more representatives to slave owners than to non-slave owners. In practice, this meant that it weighted the federal government to the South, to the countryside, rather than the northern cities. Look at these population maps for slaves as a percentage of the population. They are all across the nation, in every state, but they're clustered along the Chesapeake and along the Rice Coast. Of South Carolina and Georgia. Here, in 1810, after the Louisiana Purchase, there are slave majorities in the sugar plantations along the Mississippi. In the rest of the semester, we're going to trace these maps across the 19th century and see slavery expand across the South with cotton and contract in the North as it industrializes. But for now, just recognize that enslaved populations are larger in the South, and the 3/5 clause counted those slaves in order to give more representatives to people who owned slaves than to people who didn't. The association of staple crop production on plantations for export markets with slave labor was becoming a regional characteristic that would dog the nation for another century. It's like prisons today. The population in a prison will count as population for that county or state when it comes to population and taxation, even though inmates can't vote. The Constitution also prohibited Congress from outlawing the slave trade, and it provided national government support for things like returning slaves to their masters. These were the tough parts, and they reflect the question of who was a person and what rights did the federal government exert over states and individuals. Once these compromises had been hammered out, the rest was pretty easy, and the Constitution was written by September 1787, and it established a very different kind of government than the Articles of Confederation had done. It assumed the primacy of the federal government, where the Articles had assumed the sovereign independence of the states. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gave the National Congress a whole lot of powers. Most importantly, for the first time, the national government could lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes, to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures, to establish post offices and post roads, to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. None of these things had been specified in the Articles of Confederation, and each of them had a tendency to increase centralized power over commerce. The economic life of the nation was safeguarded to the national government over the state for all those purposes. And Article 1, Section 8 also contained what has been referred to as the elastic clause, because it allows this power to evolve and expand. It says that Congress shall have the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Here's what I'm telling you. The Constitution is a big government document. It's a license to the federal government to expand into departments that have its authority. It can tax and do all manner of things to help the economy. It can pay to build roads. It protects patents and regulates weights and measures. This was intended to correct the problems posed to the economy by the Articles of Confederation. Now, getting the American people to accept this document proved somewhat tricky. They needed a 2/3 majority of the Continental Congress to ratify the Constitution, and that means they needed 9 states of the 13 to ratify the Constitution before it could go into effect. And suddenly, the process reached an impasse. There were people out there, in the states, in the former colonies, who feared central government. You'll notice that the Constitution only allows the army to exist for 2 years at a time to meet specific threats. This was a fear of having a standing army like the British, located in the cities and the country, projecting military power. These people wanted to keep government small, cheap, close to home. They began to publish their fears of big government the Constitution would create. They published in newspapers to express specific concerns. Freedom of religion was chief among these, and freedom of the press. The individual rights to a jury trial, to protection against the right of the government to search their property or their persons, and to seize their property or persons. This fear of overreaching government was very specific about the dangers they saw. These people who were acting against the ratification of the Constitution were called anti-federalists by its supporters. The result of their objections was the Bill of Rights, which answered their specific issues but kept the primacy of the federal government over the individual states. And that was a reasonable compromise, said the individual states, and they began to ratify. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, were a compromise with Americans who feared big government, and they became known as the Anti-Federalists. They were called that by people who supported federalism, but they had no specific organization to express their interests. The Founding Fathers didn't believe in political parties. They thought they were a bad idea, and that's why the Constitution doesn't mention them. After all, political parties are unstable coalitions of disparate interests. Linking religious voters to libertarians to big business corporations doesn't make much sense, but it's a current political coalition, for example. Linking coastal elites to the equality and justice desired by ethnic and religious minorities, to working class whites with manufacturing jobs doesn't sound entirely practical, but it's a current political coalition, for example. So, we study the 2 sides that emerged during the writing and ratification of the Constitution because they represent the 2 streams in American political history. The Anti-Federalists, who opposed the big government Constitution, and the people who defended it became the Federalists. This is a new outline. It expands some of the points at the bottom of the outline that began this lecture. It provides examples of the general thesis, the political ideas stretching back to the ratification of the Constitution influenced a series of party systems. The Federalists will become the Whigs in upcoming lectures, a party that falls apart in the 1850s and realigns as the Republican Party in 1856, and the opposition to the Constitution called by their opponents the Anti-Federalists, who will become the Democrat Republicans and then the Democrats, a name they retain even today. But we'll see all that happen in upcoming weeks. In the last decades of the 1700s and the first of the 1800s, the first party system emerged during the writing and ratification of the Constitution. An excellent example of a Federalist is Alexander Hamilton, who helped write the Constitution and then financed the Revolution through his European connections. The French who bought bonds, for example. He would want to be sure they were paid back, so he supported the provisions in the Constitution that allowed the federal government the power to tax. Likewise, George Washington was a Federalist, a supporter of the Constitution, a hero of the War for Independence, and the first president of the United States. These men had won the battle and got the Constitution ratified, and as a result, they were in power. In 1796, George Washington declared that he would not run for a 3rd term as president. So his vice president, John Adams, ran for the presidency and won, keeping the Federalist side of things in power. He was an unpopular president, was John Adams, the Massachusetts lawyer who had put forward the name of Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. Now it's 20 years later, and John Adams is president, and the Federalists have been in power since the ratification of the Constitution in 1788. You can see that he's got that urban northern thing going with his lace sleeves and his fingers. And the criticisms mounted by people who opposed the federal power were beginning to gain steam. The economy was poor in the 1790s, and Adams had engaged in a quasi-war with France, and there were scandals related to the XYZ affair and the Alien and Sedition Acts. Here, Thomas Jefferson began to protest. Thomas Jefferson wrote protests about the Alien and Sedition Acts, and in that way began to embody the objections to the Federalists. He began to express an anti-Federalist point of view. The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed by Congress in 1798 and signed into law by President John Adams, and these acts made it harder for new immigrants to vote. It threatened them with deportation. Jefferson began to publish essays criticizing these acts as the federal power gone too far, and found himself articulating the anti-Federalist view when the Federalists had been in power for 12 years already. He was on the winning side for the election of 1800. Now, I said that the Founding Fathers didn't believe in political parties, so it's not as if the Anti-Federalists were a party opposed to the Federalists. They weren't that well organized, but they put up a candidate to run against John Adams, the incumbent president, in 1800, and that man was Thomas Jefferson. The Federalists painted Jefferson as a dangerous man. Here is a political cartoon that shows him in the arms of the devil, with a bottle beside him, pulling down the columns of the federal government, while the eagle kind of spits fire at him. The federal government always carries this kind of iconography, uses these symbols, the column, the eagle. Whenever you see those items, you know they're intended to appeal to the big government Federalists who believe in strong centralized federal government. Here, it's the party of George Washington and John Adams. And Jefferson is threatening to destroy it. That's how much the Federalists feared their opposition in the candidacy of Thomas Jefferson. When all of the ballots were counted on February 11th, 1801, it became clear that the vote was a tie. And when the Electoral College results in a tie, the decision must be made by the House of Representatives, as you read in the Constitution, and the House could not decide. It voted 36 times before the presidency went to Thomas Jefferson, and for the first time, the opposition was voted into power. The political groups that supported Jefferson's candidacy for president were little political clubs rather than a formal political party. Some of these clubs called their members the Democrats, but sometimes they were called the Republicans, and historians generally consider them the Democrat Republicans, just to confuse you. Not really, but it is confusing. Just remember, the Anti-Federalists opposed the big government embodied in the Constitution. With the election of Thomas Jefferson as president in 1800, they became Democrat Republicans. They represent the small government wing of the American political spectrum. But Jefferson didn't govern as a small government man. He established an embargo that dictated government control of commerce and demonstrated that he didn't understand economics very well. The embargo was an intervention in the economy by the government, with negative results for American commerce. He also took the radical step of enlarging the nation when he bought Louisiana from the French. Remember, there was no provision in the Constitution that would permit that. He wanted only to buy New Orleans for $10 million, but the French offered the whole territory, 828,000 square miles, for just $15 million, and he bought it. The American government made a down payment of gold totaling $3 million and financed the rest by debt, by bonds that European banks bought to profit from American expansion. And expand America did. With this purchase, the territory of the United States doubled, and new territories meant new people moving out there, forming states, and creating what would become an unbearable conflict within the political structure of the United States. For the Constitution established a mechanism for new states to form and join the Union, but the interests of the West would soon differ from those of the old colonies. And I'll pick up the story when I turn to westward expansion and the emerging sectional differences among the different regions of the nation.